Yeah. So, and I'm recording this as well, just because we have a few that want to watch it that aren't going to be here. For some reason, I did it on my phone Sunday, and I did it on Vimeo. And then when I went to upload it to Vimeo, Vimeo just dropped the whole thing. Like, it's nowhere on my phone. It's like, oh no, anyway. So we're just going to clean record it and send it on. But did you grab one of the nutshells? Yeah. Make sure Neil's got one too, because just kind of walk through. It's going to be on the screen, but sometimes things on the screen are a little harder to see. So yeah. Grab as many as you want. That copier can run off 1,000 more if we have to. Well, here's what I kind of want to get done today. We're going to spend 4 weeks working through what I've titled this "The Problem of Evil," but really I'm sort of using the atheistic language because, at least for me, it's not a problem. I feel like we have a good solution to it. It's more of just an argument. People will argue against God using evil. But I want to accomplish through this class a few things, not only just explaining that, but helping us kind of understand why there is suffering in the world. Why do we live in a world that is so, in some ways, broken, yet on the other hand, so beautiful? How can the shores of Hawaii and the trash pit in the Pacific coexist? That just such beauty and such horrific ugliness, even on a physical level. Then how can you have such amazing altruistic things like people sacrificing their lives to go run into the burning towers on 9/11, and then have some places absolute brutal horrors coexist on the same planet. So we're going to get into that as well. But today, really, I want to take kind of the wisdom of the book of Job. And when Job's friends show up, obviously Job's friends don't give a lot of good advice. The bulk of the book of Job is their suggestions, which falter and fail in many ways. But I do want to start off with, in Job chapter 2, verse 9, Job has just lost everything. Not only his family and possessions, goods, his health, everything. Verse 9, then, his wife says to him, "Do you still hold fast to your integrity? Curse God and die." But he said to her, "You speak as one of the foolish women speak. Shall we indeed accept good from God and not accept adversity?" And all this Job did not sin with his lips. Now when Job's 3 friends heard of all the adversity that had come upon him, they came each one from his own place. Eliphaz the Temanite, and Bildad the Shuhite, and Zophar the Naamathite. They came and they made an appointment together to come to sympathize with him and comfort him. And when they lifted up their eyes at a distance and did not recognize him, they raised their voices and wept. And each of them tore his robes and threw dust over their heads towards the sky. Then they sat down on the ground with him for 7 days and 7 nights, with no one speaking a word to him, for they saw that his pain was very great. We know this passage well. We've read through it many times, and I think incredible wisdom for us to not rush into trying to give the answer right away. Because sometimes, and I'm guilty of this as a pastor, I want to fix things. Sometimes in trying to fix it so quick, we sort of minimize the reality of the pain. Because what we're going to see as we go through, especially today, just how deep and how pervasive the pain is. It's easy for us, when we're not walking through the pain, to minimize the reality of the pain that someone else is walking through. It's what I've said so many times. One of my professors taught me in seminary the difference between minor surgery and major surgery. Minor surgery that you're having, major surgery that I'm having. Personal felt pain is always has a deeper sting than pain that someone else experiences. So I think it's good wisdom for us to just pause for a moment, kind of slowly get into the answer, but first just sort of gravitate towards the reality of the pain and how deep and pervasive it is. I do feel a little bit of sympathy with Job's wife. The more I read through this, at first I would read this and think, man, how awful is she? Just that she's given up on God. She's awful. But I think in many ways, Job's wife gets the reality of the pain as well. Is that things have gotten so bad Your only alternative is just simply, let's just go ahead and get this over with, because it's not going to get better. And we do minister in a world in which some people get to that point. They feel like things aren't going to get any better. They feel like they've hit rock bottom and they're stuck there. I think if we're going to minister to them well and provide them what I would say the Bible provides, real, useful answers, let's meet them in their pain and then over time move them out. So that's where we then begin to kind of start off with, I start off by just pulling a few quotes. One, because of course we have to realize and admit that evil is real. There are some today that are trying to deny it, which I think to some extent on an intellectual level, if you're going to deny the existence of absolutes, then you do have to sort of deny that we can't really define what evil is, because at what point does it become evil, and at what point is it no longer good? If there's no clear standard, well, then you're left with this, well, what may be evil for you is not necessarily evil for me. It may just be, well, you just need to suck it up, tough it out a little bit more, Michael. Whereas if there's an objective good standard, then we can say, no, actually that is evil and suffering. And I think especially gets into more we'll talk about in a little bit with natural evil. How can we define that as evil and not just the circumstances we happen to live in? Well, we can do that because we have an objective standard. But Shakespeare, I think, paints it really well when he says, hell is empty and all the devils are here. I mean, we live in a world that is filled with evil. We live in a world in which it is all-encompassing, and it's everywhere. It's not only the reality of things that we do that are consequences of the choices we make, but also just life. Thoreau, one of the great thinkers of American history, would chime in to say not only is evil real, but it's complex. And I think he points to the complexity of it when it says that there are 1,000 that are hacking at the branches of evil to one who is actually striking at the root. And I see this in a lot of sort of pop psych, a lot of the surface level attempts to try to salve the emotional reality of pain. A lot of times it's hacking at branches and not getting to the actual root, which again, I'm going to argue the Bible gets to the root, which really will, I think, give people a lasting ability to weather real evil and real suffering. Of course, it's not always just abstract, because I think Solzhenitsyn is right, the great Russian thinker, when he says the battle line between good and evil runs through the heart of every man. And there is an aspect of evil in which we do have to kind of look ourselves in the mirror and go, okay, we kind of did that. There's things that we do that cause immediate harm to others, or even sometimes later harm, whether it be an immediate action I do to one or just the consequences of my actions much further down the road. There's a large part of evil we have to look at ourselves and go, it's me. Hi, I'm the problem, to quote Taylor Swift, the great philosopher. I had to do that. I've been waiting.
Don't you think, though, we are on that line?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, don't you think we walk the line? You know that symbol, that kind of yin-yang symbol, the white part and the black part, and then there's this border between them. I think kind of a lot of the times we're on that line most of the time.
Between good and evil?
So
yeah,
we have that.
Yeah.
Kind of
Well,
in our reach.
And biblically think of the conflicted nature of man.
Yeah.
We're in one part, Luther would say this, we're at one part justified and sinner.
Right.
Simulus peccator et justus is the phraseology. I'm both in Christ, I'm sanctified, I'm righteous, there's a new life that's living in me.
Yeah.
And at the same time, I'm the sinner, I'm still trying to kill that. I'm starving that out. And we oftentimes, we don't necessarily walk it well. But yeah, I think, but I think also Stephen Fry, the next slide, there are some evils that we can't just simply pin on man. There's some sufferings we can't just simply say, well, it's your fault. Yeah. And Stephen Fry, he's a British comedian, actor. He was asked one time in an interview that if you were to stand before God, of course, Stephen Fry does not believe in God. He's an atheist. But if you were to stand before God one day at pearly gates and you could ask him a question, what would you ask him? And this led into a long diatribe that has been broadcast on the internet multiple times. Stephen Fry, one of his big quotes was, he would say, the God who made this universe, if it was created by God, is quite clearly a maniac. His response, he would go on to say, he would ask of God, he would say to God this: how dare you create a world in which there is such misery that is not our fault? It's not right. It's utterly, utterly evil. Why should I respect a capricious, mean-minded, stupid God who creates a world which is so full of injustice and pain? Now, in one aspect, he's hitting on, I think, a right topic, because there is some pain for which we cannot say it's your fault. There's some things that happen that I can't say it's directly because of what you did. Some I can. And so then he goes from there and says, well, if that exists, then I'm blaming God for that. And if I'm blaming God for that, then this is the most maniacal, the most evil of beings that he could ever think of, would be the fact that there would be someone who could do something about it, but didn't. In that same interview, he would go on to talk about, apparently, I guess he had studied, there were some insects in Africa who their life cycle is to burrow into eyeballs and then eat and work their way out. And it's left a lot of children in Africa blind. And Stephen Fry's like, why would God even allow, if he really exists, why would he allow such a being to be on this earth? Why even create that? And there are some things that bring about incredible pain and incredible suffering that are not directly the causes of someone's choice. We kind of get that part. Which leads us to where a lot of people are very angry at God, or very angry at the concept of God, because they have walked through some particular pointed season of pain, which they really couldn't come up with a good reason or rationale for. They'll sometimes be very dedicated, faithful church members, and then just all of a sudden they just disappear. There's family members that I know of that at one point in time, they loved the Lord, they served the Lord, they followed him. Something tragic happened, and they've checked out. And probably all of you know someone as well. That this is, I think, something that's very shared within our experience of walking the journey of faith. Is we have known some that have been hit very pointedly by pain, and they've not handled it well. But on the flip side, we know some as well that have handled really pointed pain, and it's done nothing more than strengthen their faith. And that's hopefully when we get through these next 4 weeks, we'll come out of it with that foundation, that whenever I get to that place where the pain does come, I'm able to process it well. Because I think what happens fundamentally, and William Lane Craig talks about this a good bit, my old professor Bruce Little talked about it too. I love him at Southeastern. Go Southeastern. I need that plug in. You should transfer to Southeastern, by the way.
Yeah, I like it.
Just say it. Just say it. But you have a set of beliefs, all right, that you hold to, and you try to make it as consistent as possible, all right. But we think it works, and then at some point in time, something happens that challenges that. Now, one of two things has to happen. Either your understanding of the challenge has to happen or has to change, or your understanding of what you thought the world was has to change. And so we want to make sure that this is solid and this is right and this is good. If our theology is bad, if our theology is weak, it's going to open us up to opportunities to be challenged by the world and the things that happen in it. And sometimes, like Stephen Fry and others, sometimes we throw the baby out with the bathwater. Okay, this is Anthony Flew. Anthony Flew has passed away now, but Anthony Flew was one of the leading atheists of his generation. He was the Richard Dawkins before Richard Dawkins. Anthony Flew later on in life abandoned atheism and said he had moved towards theism. He said, I believe there is a God. He didn't say he was buying into any one particular one, but he did specifically later on in life say that the reason why he rejected the Christian notion of God, though he believed there was a God, was because of this existence of evil. And he didn't go as far as Fry to be quite brash in his vocabulary, but he just felt like it was inconsistent for a God to exist as we depict God to be and evil to exist in the same world. So these are real problems that real people deal with.
I think a lot of atheists are theists. It's just they can't get past the suffering or that trauma that's happened in their life or that trauma that's happened to somebody around them, and they can't get past that. So they can't resolve that enough to say, okay, yeah, I'm willing to say, not only is there a God, and maybe, but there's also the personal God too. So
It's the other side of the coin on Romans 1. So Romans 1 talks about people suppressing the truth because of their preference for sin. Their preference for sin overrides their realization, their recognition of God. The other side of that coin is maybe not so directly sin, but, okay, I have suffered the consequences of sin. And because of that, I reject that there would be a God, even though deep down they know it. And there's a lot of stories like that. I mean, Dawkins himself, you listen to his story, he grew up as a Christian. A lot of people that are now very vocal anti had a basis in faith that somewhere then they walked away from it. And a lot of times it is over suffering. Let me take a few minutes. Let's categorize evil, because when we use the word evil, that means a lot of different things. Okay? So let's make sure we got a good sort of understanding of when we use the word evil, what are we talking about? One, we mean what most people mean is moral evil. And I think that's the easiest to get. That's the easiest to understand. First person moral evil would be, I suffer because of what I did. You know, I decide after Saturday, say my Gators lose again, I've had enough. I decide to run down to the Quickie Mart or whatever. I get a fifth of Jack Daniels. I down the whole bottle. Then I wrap my tree around a telephone pole.
I'll call you back.
Yeah, we get that. Right, we get that. That's I'm suffering because of something I did. We understand that fully well. Then you have third person moral evil, which would be you suffer because of the sins or the evil desires of someone else. So there then, okay, my Gators get blown out. I've had enough. I go down the fifth of Jack Daniels, and instead of wrapping my tree around the telephone pole, I wrap it around Michael's truck. Okay, and now Michael has suffered because of my evil. All right, third person moral evil. Still moral evil. He didn't necessarily do anything to earn it, but it's still moral evil because it's a result of my moral choice, or in that case, immoral choice. The natural evil. We take a step back. There's no longer moral decisions going on, but natural evil is going to be things like hurricanes, famines, plagues. Why does wildfire break out? Why do hurricanes exist? Sure, we could get into the meteorological reasons, but there's still evil and suffering nonetheless. We would say, well, in the redeemed and the restored world, when Christ comes back, there's not going to be hurricanes. There's not going to be tornadoes. There's not going to be earthquakes. There's not going to be those things that devastate like we have on this earth now. It's a natural form of evil, still suffering nonetheless. And many people will point to God and say, okay, if you are there, why then did you allow the tornado to come and destroy my house or my grandmother's house? Why did you allow that? Why did the tsunami come on and drown 50,000 people? Why allow that to occur? When we talk about natural evil. Then there's physical evils. This is your domain. We deal with a lot of physical evil. It's not good. Physical evils. It's, I think of a young man that was in our Sunday school class back in seminary, 33 years of age, great health. He played basketball all the time. He ran all the time, amazing physical shape. One day out of the middle of nowhere, he's at work in the GE appliance park. They just found him dropped over dead with a heart attack. And it's like, why? Seemingly he did everything. His doctor would have been proud of him, doing all the things that he did to keep himself in health. And then sometimes things just happen. Things like dementia, things like you walk through those and goes, oh man, why does that have to occur? Mm-hmm. There's real physical evil in this world.
Let me ask.
Yeah.
You think there was that prior to the fall?
Well, death, no. Heart attack, I don't see how. Because those are
So I'm not
yeah.
asking for the answer, I'm just,
Yeah.
I'm just trying, what do you think? Before the fall, was there a genetic defect?
I
Before
don't-
the fall, was there hardening of the arteries? Before the fall, was there cancer?
I don't think so, because I think an all-encompassing answer is we were created male and female in the garden with a perfect genetic code. Then the consequences of sin, which we'll get to later on, the consequences of sin are all-encompassing.
Yeah.
It's not just a relationship with God, it's a relationship with the earth and everything else in it.
Includes death.
Includes death. And then now every copy of the genetic code
Right.
never gets copied perfect. And that's why we encourage, don't marry your cousin like they do in Alabama, because we want to diversify the genetic pool to protect against that. So yeah, my argument then is going to be, okay, in heaven, in the redeemed, the new body
Yeah.
is the perfected genetic code. So even the Down syndrome,
To the new creation.
right?
And everything in between those.
Everything else in between is it's a defective genetic code.
Right.
So the kid who has Down syndrome here is not going to have Down syndrome. He's going to have the correct number of chromosomes
Yeah.
in the redeemed, the restored body.
Well, during in the new creation, right?
Yeah, in the new heavens and
Yeah,
new earth. Yeah,
That's right, when we get a new.
yeah. When the body is restored, renewed. Yeah,
Sure.
and that's how then.
I think natural evil too, talking about that, I think that gets I think the weather gets a bad rap. Because when you think about it, how many times in the Bible was there a hurricane? None. Well, why is the reason for that? Well, there were no hurricanes in the Middle East. So why do we hear about why is it such a problem now? Well, because people built $10 million houses at Fort Lauderdale
Yeah.
or whatever. So
Yeah.
of course they're gonna get damaged, and of course people are gonna die because they're moving in the path of it. So it's almost like that, it's always been there, but now
It
it's
has.
prevalent because
Right.
people are actually, why would you move and live on the San Andreas Fault
Right.
like 30 million people do?
Yeah.
If you walk through a fire, guess what? You'll get burned.
Things are going to happen,
So-
and there's natural disasters in the Bible. There's earthquakes and things like
yeah,
that.
there are, but absolutely.
But of course, we live in a day of 24-hour
now
news.
It's our own choices that actually puts us in the line
Right.
of fire, so to speak, right? You're not seeing hurricanes in Iran or
Yeah.
in Israel.
Yeah, but because of 24-hour news cycle, you hear of every earthquake in Iran
Really quickly. Right.
that
Yeah.
we would have never heard of
Instantly,
before.
right.
And so, yeah,
Right.
that and an increase in population. There's more
Sure.
people to suffer. So that, and then I throw in fourth, gratuitous evil, because let's be nuanced on the definition. Gratuitous evil and fundamentally just simply means evil that occurs for which there is no purpose, none anywhere. My argument is going to be that we can define gratuitous evil as evil that exists for where there is not an apparent purpose to. And I think that's much more where people live, is they'll see evil and they don't see an immediate or at least a relatively connected purpose to it. So again, the kid in Africa who the insects burrow into his eyes and blinds him. We don't really see an immediate connection to any sort of purpose to that. Sure, theologically, we can probably draw out a long connected, purpose in behind that, but at a surface level, practically, we mean that for them, it appears gratuitous. And though that's not the technical term of gratuitous, that's the functional term of gratuitous. And sometimes functionality actually surpasses what is real. I stole, borrowed, plagiarized this slide, but I'm giving credit for it because it is William Lane Craig who put that together. And it's a simple diagram, but I saw it and I'm like, that's what I want to say, so it works. So no need to reinvent the wheel. But when we talk about, the existence of evil and the existence of God, some people have a problem with those two both existing. And it's come out in various arguments. And so this kind of breaks down sort of the thought chain of the various arguments. One, an emotional problem. It's an emotional problem of evil and then on the other side, an intellectual problem, which is going to be a logical version and an evidential version. So let's kind of jump into that real quick. An emotional problem and I think emotional is where most people reside. Most people are not going to get into the logical formulas we'll get into a moment. Most people are going to reside in the emotional level. That doesn't mean that it's less important. It doesn't mean that they're simpler minded people. It's just where people exist. And an emotional problem of evil is going to look more like, I don't like the fact that a God would allow so much suffering. There's an emotional reaction to, okay, my 5-year-old child died of bone cancer. Therefore, I can't imagine a God looking at that and going, okay, I'm just not going to do anything. Maybe they've even particularly prayed a lot for that child's healing. There's some sort of emotional reaction to this or this happened, and now I'm rejecting the idea of a God, or at least I may not go fully and say there is no God. I may say at least that kind of a God doesn't exist, and it's an emotional response to it. And a lot of times that is going back to the held beliefs, okay? The held beliefs that we hold to. When real world realities hit those, if they don't fit together well, we're sort of forced to jettison one or the other. And it's really not practical to ask someone to jettison the idea that a 5-year-old child dying of bone cancer is suffering. That certainly is. So then oftentimes they go to the theologically held beliefs and go, okay, well, what's wrong there? And like I said, a lot of times they do throw the baby out with the bathwater. And a lot of times it is because of an unbiblical or an underdeveloped theology that leaves us exposed. So for instance, the folks that listen to prosperity gospel, word of faith, deliverance ministries. All right, so if I have this ailment, if I trust God enough, then he's going to cure it. Obviously, it's bad theology. But a lot of people hold to that. And a lot of people think that is true, so that when suffering does come, when they go to their church and they go to their pastor and they pray and they do all the oils and the cloths and they do everything they're supposed to do, and the cancer doesn't go away, now that theology is challenged because they've bought into an idea that, well, God will if I have enough faith. And I have enough faith. So sometimes then they jettison the whole system. And there's a lot of people that come out of the prosperity gospel that have not only rejected prosperity theology, they've rejected God entirely because it has failed. I grew up in Pensacola, so Brownsville revival is going on. And you can read the history books, talk about the Brownsville revival. Towards the end of it, there was a couple down in South Florida. Their infant child died, most likely SIDS. They put the child in a box in the trunk, drive up to Pensacola, and at the very next revival meeting, they're bringing their dead baby to the preachers because they so believed that this was true, that God would bring their child back to life. So clearly reality hit their theological beliefs. Now, I don't know what became of that family. That was just a news story that got some traction for a while. That did occur. But clearly their theology was not developed properly so that when the trial and the tragedy hit, where they went from that, I pray that they got some good counseling to understand what Scripture really does teach. But it definitely conflicted with their thought. So this leaves people in a spot where many times they do simply just walk away from God because their theology hasn't been well developed. And I agree with C.S. Lewis. You do that now when you're not in the suffering. Don't do it while you're in the suffering. When you're in the suffering, you're Job's friends. You sit around and you weep, you throw dust over your head, you rip your clothes, you weep and you feel the pain with them. You try to develop the theology beforehand, hence the purpose for this class. Then on the logical side, and this is J.L. Mackey's formulation, so I'm pulling from the opposing side, all right? Good rule of debate, good rule of, I think, just life in general, is if you're going to argue against something, have a good understanding of what you're arguing against. So this is J.L. Mackey's formulation. This is not mine. It's put into logical theorems of, okay, God is supremely good. The Bible would teach that. God is the highest definition of good. There's nothing better than God. He is the fulfillment of all morality. God is supremely good. God is omnipotent. That means that we believe the Bible teaches God can do essentially anything other than obviously logical, incompatible things. So some people like to go, oh, we're going to disprove God. So I'm going to ask Neil. Neil, can God make a rock so big that he can't move it? And then the Christian goes, I don't know. I guess he can't. Oh, well, then God's not omnipotent. Well, actually, no, that's not. We're not even getting in the realm of omnipotence. We're dealing with just logical, incongruent things. It's like talking about married bachelors or squared circles. Yeah, it's a false equivalent. And so you're left in this conundrum of, okay, making sure we understand omnipotence well. What does that mean? Well, yeah, there's some things you might be able to say God can't do, but it's not a deficiency in omnipotence. It's a logical inconsistency, like the making a rock so big that you can't move it type thing. But God is functionally, he's omnipotent. He can do what he wills to do. Then God is omniscient. We believe that God knows all things, past, present, and future. That's how the Bible teaches it. Everything that has occurred, God knows with perfect knowledge. He doesn't forget anything. Everything going on present, God knows with perfect knowledge. And everything in the future, God knows with perfect knowledge as well. That's omniscience. So if God is supremely good, and if God is omnipotent, and God is omniscient, we also have to affirm that evil does exist. So then Mackey's argument is going to begin to say then one of those have to be thrown out. So you have to then say if evil exists, that means that maybe God isn't supremely good. Maybe he is all-powerful and all-knowing, but he just decides, I'm not going to do anything about it. Or maybe he's still supremely good, but he is not omnipotent, so he just can't do anything about it. Or then maybe he's not omniscient. It's like, well, he is good. He could do something about it. He just couldn't see it coming. So that would be, God is working through the history of the world, and Adolf Hitler's born. Adolf Hitler gets into power in Germany. God still doesn't know what's going to happen. Adolf Hitler kills a few people, but he doesn't know how the full extent of it. And so you end up having the Holocaust. And God couldn't do anything about it just because he didn't know it was coming. So that would be, Mackey would say, you got to jettison one of those. Because what Mackey is going to argue is you can't jettison the idea that evil exists, because clearly it does. So that's the logical problem. The only problem is this one has largely fallen out of favor in the last few years. Even most atheists don't argue this anymore. This tends to be YouTube atheist. Okay, the guys that they've seen a little 5-minute video and they know this. This is easily defeated and quickly defeated, and it's morphed into what we talk about, the evidential problem. This is more of a probabilistic formula. So same thing, God is supremely good, God is omnipotent, God is omniscient, but evil exists in such a high amount in random distribution that it's good evidence that God does not exist. So it's more of a most likely there's not a God. And then you would prefer that because that's the most likely explanation. That's where more of the logical arguments go these days. I think there's still sufficient reason to reject this. But this is at least where it's being argued a little bit more now. Is that, okay, we recognize that just because evil exists doesn't completely jettison on a logical point the idea of God. It just makes it most probabilistic that he's not there, at least as it's defined. So that's getting back into then how do we define it? How do we understand it? Gets back to, again, when we talk about then the categories of evil. Think about that last slide. Then it's like, okay, first person moral evil, I get it. Okay, I did something wrong, I suffer. third person evil, I still kind of get it. I did something wrong, but that's still, I am to blame for the fact that you're now suffering. We can see that. Those dots are easy to connect. Natural evil, this gets a little tougher. All right, where do I connect the dot on that? Well, yeah, I mean, I can go back to the garden and I can point to the consequences of sin. Those dots get a little bit harder to connect. Like, why a tsunami? Why an earthquake? Why a flood? Things like that. Then physical evil, the dots get a little bit harder to connect. We've moved a little bit further away from moral agency, and now we're dealing in a fallen, sinful world. And of course, when we get to gratuitous, people are completely jettisoning really any logic, going, nah, there's no point to it. That's going to be our challenge in the next few sessions, is then to begin to sort of connect those dots a lot easier. Historically, this has happened before. Of course, Neil, yeah, I'm going to talk about history. All right. So, yeah, go figure. So Leibniz in the early 1500s, Leibniz begins to argue. He's building on what Augustine did. Augustine, in his first attempt, Augustine basically said God does not allow any evil for which there is not a greater good that comes from it. Okay, and that's been the basis for a lot of our understanding of sort of solving this problem. We're going to talk about that more later. But Leibniz sort of develops on it. He says, well, okay, but his argument sort of bases on the idea that God has created the best of all possible worlds. Okay? In other words, God could have made a whole bunch of different things. He chose to make this one. And because he is supremely good, this is the best one. So his argument would be, even though Leibniz was not alive for the Holocaust, his argument would be that this world has the Holocaust, but any other world would have had something much worse. That's going to be his argument. Unfortunately for Leibniz, he dies before 1555, when you have this horrific earthquake in Lisbon. That, for multiple things. One, it happens on All Saints' Day. So it occurs on a high holy day, and it destroys the entire city, destroys all the churches. Like 12 to 15,000 people die in the earthquake. Another 30,000 people die in the tsunami that comes from it. And this is where then people like Voltaire and others are on the scene now. Leibniz is dead, so he can't answer it, but they're attacking Leibniz and going, what? Was Lisbon more promiscuous than Paris? Was London more flamboyant than Lisbon happened to be? Why Lisbon? And they begin to attack this idea of, is this really the best possible world? Which, of course, then, if you study philosophy, Voltaire and others, you leave this sort of certainty and you move into this, well, we can't really know, which is where they love to exist. Now, granted, we've moved beyond sort of the postmodern, can we really know phase, because we've realized that just doesn't work. The whole history of that goes from Voltaire, then you end up with guys like Derrida who are going, even language, you can't even know what that means. And that just breaks down everything. Because how do we even know he's right if language has no meaning? How can he be right? And so we've largely moved away from that, even in the academic circles, to go, no, it's not that. We can know. Now the argument is over who has the authority to declare what they know. And so now we live in a world where it's science versus religion. Does science have the ultimate say in what is supremely true? Or is there others that are weighing into that also? That's where the argument's moved. But gratuitous evil, I'm gonna pick your brains for a little bit. We got a few minutes. Do you think there is evil that exists, suffering that exists, for which there is seemingly no purpose?
No,
Okay.
I don't think so. I think there is purpose for it.
Mm.
Whose purpose it is, I think we have to kind of define that.
Sure.
So God definitely has a purpose for his world.
Yeah.
It is,
Yeah.
for us, redemption.
Mm.
So that's really the overarching,
Mm.
whole theme of creation.
Mm.
So, but at least one
Mm.
or more were kicked out of perfection because of a choice that they made
Yeah.
based on pride which we have to. And
Yeah.
I think a lot of our choices are based on that one thing. You can actually say that all of our sin could come from pride in a way. To me, when you look at when we look at the literal interpretation of the Bible, I think you could defend that but from different perspectives. So number one, I think we have to put God where He needs to be. So to me, God is, and you see this in mere Christianity too. So God is transcendent over everything. So everything that all the suffering, all the cancer, hurricanes, all that is space-time matter. That's what we can imagine.
Yeah.
Because that's the creation that He has given us. But He is out of that creation as well. He was before that creation.
Yeah.
Will be after whenever this new creation. So I
Yeah.
think God's transcendent. In fact, in mere Christianity, He describes time as this. If we're sitting right here and this is this point in time, which by the time I'm saying this, we've already passed that point in time.
Right.
Everything that way is all the past. Everything that way is the future. And even if we could define a beginning of our creation, God's over all that, all at once.
Right.
So it's almost like what you were saying before, kind of rephrasing it. It's not that He necessarily has to remember all that in the past or know about that in the future.
Yeah.
He's already there, all at once, and we can't grasp that.
Right.
We can't grasp that transcendent dimension.
Yeah.
And I think when you put it in perspective of that's certainly we can't understand that because we're here in this creation.
Yeah.
And God is over everything and in everything as well because He's here too.
Yeah.
I think when you put it in that perspective, it's very, very difficult to. I think it's easier to separate the evil from the
It helps.
Yeah.
Because you're right, and the theologians speak of as God as being in the eternal present.
Absolutely.
It is. It's not so much Him remembering, but it is all. That's why Scripture speak of. He knows the ends from the beginning.
It's there
because He sees it.
Next week, it's
Yeah.
in the new creation.
And that's that.
In the beginning and all.
That's that inner struggle that even we see in Scripture of, yes, I know. As the old hymn would say, I know in who I believed in. I'm persuaded that He's able to keep that which He's committed unto me and against that day.
Yeah.
Like I know that God is going to redeem. I know He is going to save. I know He's going to. All this works out, but it's the trudging through the day to day that's so difficult.
Yeah.
That's where David even in Psalm 73 would talk about as for me, my foot it almost slipped when I looked around and I saw the wicked prosper. I saw so much evil seeming to get by pretty good. Even David would wrestle with this question of, Lord, why is it this way? Now, again, for us, if you develop good theology, it's going to sort of fortify you against the suffering.
Yeah.
Doesn't mean you're not going to experience it. Doesn't mean you're not even going to suffer through it. But again, it's going to keep perspective in. Yeah, and that's why I kind of like I said, I nuanced my definition of gratuitous evil.
Yeah.
I do agree that when we get there, the old song, farther along we'll know more about it. Farther along we'll understand why. When we get there, we're going to see the whole picture and go, oh, okay, all right. By golly, walking through it right now hurts,
I wrote this down too when you were talking about at the beginning. Do we choose evil without temptation? So in other words, when we make the choices that we make,
right?
Certainly can we do them without having any temptation from the evil one? Right.
Well, and that becomes, I think, an important distinction when we begin to talk about the realities of heaven. Because God has created us with a degree of free will. So, and Augustine and others get into this idea of, okay, what turns the will? What turned Adam and Eve's will from righteousness to evil, and then what still does today? What makes us go that route? And he gets into these ideas of temptation being, if you remove that out, If you, in case of what happens then in the age to come, evil, sin, all that is bound up and thrown in the lake of fire. If you're in an eternal state where there is no more temptation, you can maintain free will and not have sin. At least that's the argument that a lot of us make. I think that's kind of how I would see it, is when we're going to be there, we're not going to sin. We're still going to have free will, but we're not going to want to. The will's not going to want to go that way anymore. And I think C.S. Lewis, you mentioned Mere Christianity. Reading A Grief Observed is a great book as well. Because he goes through, the loss of his wife and all that, and what he experienced. He puts that down on paper and wrestles with the grief that he walked through. Comes out of it, of course, with a theological grounding. There's a lot of insight we pull out of that book as well. Not like you don't have enough to do already, but if you hadn't read Grief Observed.
Let me give you another one. Let me give you a tough one. So that's theological people.
Okay.
What about the case that in the very perfection that it was, in God's perfection of heaven or that realm, whatever you call it, why was a created being allowed to make a bad choice and be kicked out? And was that sin? And if it was, then why did sin take place in a perfection?
Yeah. How does the first one start?
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I think personally that's
influenced by the tempter. The tempter came from a perfect place. Then why was that allowed to happen?
For me, it goes back to the very definition of what free will is. If God is, and again, God is sovereign, he can do, within logical reasons, anything he wants to. God decides to create a world in which there is free will.
Yeah.
Which I would argue, okay, Leibniz is right on this. This is a better world, a world in which there are free.
I'm not talking about our world. Certainly there's free will here.
Yeah.
But you said even in the new creation, which I agree, we won't want to make a bad decision.
Right.
We won't want to sin. We won't want to do that. But it was done before us in the perfection of...
Oh, you're talking about when Satan fell?
Yeah.
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 Yeah. That was the tough question.
And that's the tough question that I don't know if we can answer, because there's not... Scripture speaks so little, even if, again, there's theological debate as to whether the verses we normally attribute to the fall of Satan being actually speaking of Satan. There's some theological debate going on that, back and forth. But even at that, even if you accept both of those texts, Isaiah and Ezekiel, I think are the two that we go to, and if we accept both of those, we go, there's still not a whole lot that tells us as to what caused that. Why was it that Satan
That's a tough one.
desired, if there was no one there to tempt him?
Yeah.
Now, some answer that and say, well, God declared it to be. But I don't know if we go that far because of the other implications of that statement. Because again, we want to think systematically. We want to come, any passage of Scripture we read, we want to see, okay, how does this fit within the broader context of Scripture as a whole? Eisegesis versus exegesis. Neil shared that online the other day. We want to see, okay, how does this fit within the whole? And sometimes we're not careful, we'll make a statement based upon a verse that we don't realize the implications of that statement on other very clear passages of Scripture. That's one of those questions I'm going to ask when I get to heaven.
Yeah.
Along with why did God make mosquitoes?
And why do you make mosquitoes?
Bats,
Food for
Yeah,
other things.
well, the bats have to have something to eat.
Why, if you're in a perfect place, why would you do something stupid like that?
That's right.
Because, okay, think,
That's the question.
well,
That was kind of the question I was getting to, really.
think back to what the temptation was. Okay, so Adam and Eve, and
Also,
they're in
that
paradise.
was not a spirit-filled human too, so that was, Satan is an angelic being, and that's very different from us. So that's one thing there.
But
even so,
Adam and Eve had perfect communion with God. There was they were experiencing existence that we don't know about yet.
Right.
Yeah.
And we're going to know about that one day,
To walk with God.
but we don't know about that yet.
Yeah.
But the serpent comes up to Eve, and the temptation is crafty. It's, did God really say not to eat of that fruit? Which she recounts back and says, well, yeah, he said not to eat it, nor even to touch it. Okay, now that was an added on part. God didn't say anything about touching it. How that got there, I don't know. Did Adam and Eve decide, hey, to protect ourselves, we're not even going to touch it? But nonetheless, God told them, yeah, not to eat of it. So then the serpent comes back and says, basically to Eve says, well, God knows the day that you eat of that fruit, you're going to be like him, knowing good from evil. And the temptation that's there is that God is holding out something from you that you could have.
It's like a child, don't touch that, they're gonna do it just to do it.
Yeah. Well, I think even more beyond that, because it builds in this idea within Eve that something exists that I don't have, and God is keeping that away from me.
Right.
Well, why is he keeping that away from me? Doesn't he love me? Isn't he concerned about me? Keep in mind, they've never experienced anything bad. So whatever this is must be really good. That's the temptation there.
Yeah.
And I think we're guilty of that still even today, that God has something he's holding out from us. In all reality, I mean, he's not. God, you read through scripture, God's laid all his cards on the table. He's like, here's what it is. So that was and it's a very crafty, cunning temptation. I mean, again, he's not anywhere on the level. This is not God and Lucifer not duking things out, for supremacy of the universe. It's not Jesus and Satan are brothers. The Mormons completely butcher that. Okay, but then again, I wouldn't expect anyone who's not even remotely close to Christianity to get much theologically right. But it's Satan is on that angelic level.
Yeah.
God is infinitely more powerful, infinitely more wise. Satan's very, very, very cunning.
Yeah, I think that's just a conflict that's not resolved.
Mhm.
And maybe one day we'll know.
Yeah.
I think that's unresolved.
Yeah,
The memes of
Yeah.
God and Satan boxing.
yeah, oh yeah.
Not,
Terrible theology.
not happening.
Yeah.
Torment the champion.
Uh-huh. But then again, people believe we're going to be floating around playing harps too. It's
Bad when
like,
you-
That's true.
It's bad when you lost.
Heaven
You don't
gained
know.
another angel.
yeah, oh yeah.